A wealthy man fell into a coma, and when he woke up, he was shocked to see an immigrant woman taking care of him. The morning sun gently filtered through the windows of the majestic Smith mansion, illuminating the expensive furniture and artworks that adorned every corner. The house was a reflection of the legacy of power and wealth that the Smith family had built over generations. At the center of this empire was Rick Smith, the eldest son, a man who had been trained from a young age to carry the weight of the family name with pride and skill. Rick, in his elegant, tailor-made suit, was in his office reviewing the latest financial reports of the family business. His face, though impeccably shaved and well-groomed, showed signs of fatigue. His eyes, usually filled with determination, seemed a bit duller, as if a shadow had settled over them. Despite his apparent success, there was something in his expression that indicated an internal struggle, a conflict that had begun to take root deep within him. As he delved into the figures, his mind wandered to his impending marriage to Adela Gomez. Adela was everything a man in his position could desire: beautiful, sophisticated, and from a well-established family. However, as the days progressed towards the wedding, Rick couldn't shake a growing sense of disconnection. The idea of marriage, which should have been a source of joy, filled him with a sense of heaviness, as if he were preparing for yet another contract rather than a lifelong commitment. Despite his doubts, Rick didn't allow these thoughts to dominate him. He had been raised to be strong, to fulfill his duty, and that duty included marrying a woman who was seen as the perfect match for a man of his status. The wedding was not just a personal union, but a strategic event that would reinforce the Smith family's position in high society. Rick understood the importance of this, but he couldn't ignore the emptiness he felt every time he thought about his future with Adela. As Rick remained engrossed in his thoughts, his mother, Victoria Smith, entered the office unannounced, as was her custom. Victoria was an imposing woman, with a presence that dominated any room. Her sharp gaze and upright posture reflected the discipline with which she had raised her children. For her, reputation and family duty were everything, and she had instilled this strict philosophy in Rick and his brother Andres. "Rick, dear," Victoria said in her usual authoritative tone, "have you reviewed the details of the reception? We cannot allow any mistakes. This wedding is crucial for our family." Rick nodded without looking up from the papers on his desk. "Yes, Mother. Everything is under control. Adela and the organizers are handling every detail." Victoria watched him closely, noticing the fatigue in her son but choosing not to mention it. For her, showing weakness was not an option. "I'm glad to hear that. Remember, Rick, this wedding is not just about you and Adela. It's about our family, our position. It's the time to consolidate what we've built." Victoria's words, though spoken firmly, resonated with a weight that overwhelmed Rick. He knew his mother was right, but he couldn't help feeling that he was sacrificing something deeper in the process. "I know, Mother. I'll do what's necessary," he replied without much enthusiasm. Satisfied with his response, Victoria patted his shoulder before leaving the office, leaving Rick alone with his thoughts once again. As the door closed behind his mother, Rick let out a sigh, feeling the weight of expectations settle even more heavily on his shoulders. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to gather strength, but instead, a strange fatigue began to invade his body. It was a tiredness that couldn't be attributed solely to work or responsibilities, but something deeper, a feeling that had been silently growing and was now beginning to show its true magnitude. Just then, the phone on his desk rang, pulling him from his thoughts. It was Adela, with her sweet and calculated tone, reminding him of the dinner they would have that night with the Gomez. A dinner that Rick knew he couldn't avoid, but that seemed like yet another burden at that moment. "Of course, Adela, I'll be there," he responded, trying to sound enthusiastic. When the call ended, Rick stared at the phone, feeling the pressure in his chest increase. Was this what he wanted for his life? The question echoed in his mind like a distant sound, one he had tried to ignore for a long time. But now, with the wedding approaching and his health beginning to falter, the question became more insistent. With effort, Rick stood up from his chair and walked to the window. He looked out at the vast garden of the mansion, perfectly maintained, a symbol of the wealth and power that had always surrounded his life. But at that moment, everything he saw seemed distant, foreign. The world he had built, or that had been built for him, no longer offered the comfort it once did. Night had fallen over the city, and the luxurious restaurant where the dinner between the Smith and Gomez families would take place was illuminated by the soft glow of candles adorning the tables. The diners, wrapped in elegant suits and dresses, spoke in whispers, exchanging smiles and approving glances as they enjoyed the delicacies served. Everything in that place breathed exclusivity and opulence, a perfect setting for the social elite. Rick and Adela arrived together, as always, projecting the perfect image of a powerful and admired couple. However, as they walked to the table reserved for them, Rick couldn't shake a growing discomfort. His arm wrapped around Adela's waist, but the contact felt distant, almost artificial. Adela, for her part, smiled with the perfection she had mastered over the years, knowing that all eyes were on them. "Dear, remember to mention the collaboration with my family's foundation during dinner," Adela whispered as she leaned slightly toward him, making sure her voice wasn't heard by others. Rick nodded, though his mind was far from the conversation. The foundation, the alliances, the appearances. All seemed like part of a game he was no longer sure he wanted to play. They sat at the main table, surrounded by Adela's parents, who exchanged compliments with Victoria and Andres. The conversation soon turned to the wedding, the event's details, and the expectations both sides had for the future union. While the others talked, Rick found himself trapped in his thoughts, observing Adela from the emotional distance where he now stood. Adela was, without a doubt, beautiful. Her flawless skin, bright eyes, and elegant bearing made her the center of attention wherever she went. But Rick, who had been by her side for years, was beginning to see beyond that perfect surface. He knew that behind that beauty and charm lay an unbridled ambition, a constant need to assert herself and secure a place at the social pinnacle. As he watched Adela laugh and converse with their parents, Rick realized that the woman beside him was a stranger. For a long time, he had ignored the signs, had accepted their relationship as something natural, a logical step in his life. But now, when everything was about to be consolidated in marriage, the doubts he had repressed were beginning to surface with force. In an attempt to shake off those thoughts, Rick took a sip of wine and joined the conversation. "The collaboration with the Gomez Foundation will be an excellent way to unite our families in a common effort," he said, trying to sound enthusiastic. Adela's parents nodded approvingly, pleased with the attention Rick was paying to important matters. Adela smiled at him, but there was a calculating glint in her eyes that Rick could no longer ignore. As the dinner progressed, Rick began to feel pressure in his chest, a tightness that went beyond the usual stress. As he looked at his reflection in the wineglass, he wondered if his body wasn't reflecting what his mind had been trying to tell him for months. The perfect image of his life was slowly unraveling, and he didn't know how to stop it. Finally, the dinner came to an end, and the families said their goodbyes with the polite gestures and compliments expected on such occasions. Adela and Rick walked out of the restaurant together, and though their hands were intertwined, the silence between them was deafening. "Tonight was a success," Adela commented as they walked toward the car. "My parents are very pleased with how things are being organized. The wedding will be a big event." Rick nodded silently, not wanting to prolong the conversation. His thoughts remained trapped in the tightness he felt, in the disconnection that was now impossible to ignore. "Adela," Rick began, his voice barely a whisper, "have you ever wondered if this is what we really want?" Adela stopped in her tracks, surprised by the question. She looked at him with a mix of confusion and disdain. "What do you mean?" she replied, trying to stay calm, though there was a note of nervousness in her voice. "This life, the wedding, everything—" Rick paused, searching for the right words. "I feel like we're following a script, one that wasn't written by us but by our families, by society. Is this really what we want, or is it just what's expected of us?" Adela looked at him with an expression that mixed disbelief and irritation. "Rick, you know our lives have always been destined to be this way. It's not a matter of wanting or not wanting, it's who we are. We can't just walk away from everything we've built." Rick felt the distance between them grow even more apparent with those words. He knew Adela didn't understand him, and at that moment, he realized that perhaps she never would. "Maybe you're right," he finally said, with a resignation that pained him deeply. "Maybe there's just no other option." Relieved that the conversation hadn't escalated, Adela kissed him on the cheek. "Trust me, Rick, everything will be fine," she said with a smile meant to be comforting, but that only highlighted the coldness Rick felt. Back at the mansion, Rick retreated to his room with a sense of emptiness he couldn't shake. As he undressed and prepared for bed, his mind kept circling the same question. Was this really the life he wanted? He knew he needed to talk to someone, to express the doubts that tormented him, but every time he tried, he was met with the same wall of expectations and responsibilities. He lay down in bed, hoping sleep would come soon, but instead of rest, his mind kept hammering at the thought that he was trapped in a life that didn't belong to him. As the hours passed, the physical and emotional exhaustion became unbearable, and finally Rick fell asleep, but found no relief in his dreams. The sun was just beginning to rise over the city when Rick Smith woke up, not by choice but by the intense discomfort that had been tormenting him for days. He felt drained, as if he hadn't slept at all, even though he had spent most of the night in bed. The physical fatigue mingled with a weight on his chest that made it difficult to breathe normally. He glanced at the clock on the nightstand. It was barely 6 in the morning. He knew he had a long and demanding day ahead, full of crucial meetings for the company. Despite the discomfort, Rick got out of bed determined to face his responsibilities. After all, being a smith meant never showing weakness, no matter the circumstances. The bathroom mirror reflected a worrying image. His face, normally full of life, now looked pale, with deep, dark circles and lifeless eyes. He splashed cold water on his face, trying to wake up, but the exhaustion persisted, deeply rooted in his body and mind. He went downstairs to the dining room, where Victoria, his mother, was already waiting, as she did every morning. Mrs. Smith, impeccable in her silk dress with her characteristic proud demeanor, looked up from her coffee cup as her son entered. "Rick, it seems you didn't sleep well," Victoria commented, though her tone was more observational than concerned. "Just a little tired, Mother. Nothing I can't handle," Rick replied, downplaying it. Victoria studied him closely for a moment, assessing his condition but chose not to probe further. She knew Rick had been under a lot of pressure, but she also trusted his ability to handle any situation. "Remember, today you have the meeting with the Japanese investors. It's crucial that you close that deal. The expansion into Asia is vital for the company," she said, with the firm tone she always used when it came to business. Rick nodded, though the thought of facing another meeting made him feel even more drained. He finished his breakfast in silence, knowing that every move and decision of the day would be under his mother's strict scrutiny. The following hours passed in a sort of haze for Rick. His body moved almost by inertia, answering calls, reviewing documents, preparing presentations for the meeting. But his mind was scattered, fighting against the growing sense of exhaustion and the constant pressure that seemed to crush him from within. Finally, the time for the meeting arrived. Rick entered the boardroom, politely greeting the investors who were already waiting. He sat at the head of the table, where he always felt more comfortable, more in control. But today, that control seemed to be slipping slowly from his grasp. As the meeting progressed, Rick struggled to stay focused. His voice, though slightly weaker than usual, resonated with the authority he had always projected. The investors listened attentively, interested in every word Rick said. However, the pressure in his chest intensified, and a cold sweat began to cover his forehead. While presenting the numbers and projecting the company's future, he felt a sudden dizziness. The world around him seemed to wobble, and Rick had to grip the table to avoid falling. The investors looked at him, surprised by his sudden silence. "Excuse me for a moment," Rick murmured, trying to regain control, but his body no longer responded as he wanted. The pain in his chest intensified, as if an invisible fist were squeezing it tightly. His vision began to blur, and before he could ask for help, the dizziness turned into a dark abyss. Rick collapsed to the floor, unconscious, as those present shouted in alarm. Within seconds, the boardroom turned into chaos. Someone called emergency services, while others tried to revive him. The news of Rick Smith's collapse spread quickly throughout the building, reaching the ears of his mother and Adela. Victoria Smith, upon hearing the news, felt a stab of panic that she quickly suppressed. She knew she had to maintain composure, especially at a moment like this. As she headed toward the boardroom, her mind was already calculating the implications of what had happened. She wasn't only worried about her son's health, but also about how this would affect the family's and the company's image. Adela, on the other hand, felt a mixture of shock and fear. Although her relationship with Rick had been full of tension, she had never imagined that something like this could happen. The thought that her fiancé, the man who would guarantee her a life of luxury and power, was in danger, filled her with an anxiety she couldn't control. Minutes later, the paramedics arrived and rushed Rick to the hospital. Victoria and Adela followed in a separate car, both lost in their own thoughts and concerns. The gravity of the situation was becoming evident, and with each passing minute, the tension grew. At the hospital, the doctors worked quickly to stabilize Rick. After a series of tests, they finally gave their verdict. Rick had suffered a collapse due to a condition that had gone unnoticed for years, exacerbated by extreme stress. His body simply couldn't take it anymore, and now he was in critical condition. Rick was placed in an intensive care unit where doctors closely monitored his condition. However, despite their efforts, Rick did not respond to the treatments. Days passed in agonizing waiting, and finally, Rick fell into a deep coma, from which the doctors couldn't assure he would wake up. The news of Rick's coma spread quickly, causing a great stir in social circles and the media. Everyone wanted to know what had happened to the powerful heir of the Smith family, and speculations began to arise. The family, known for its influence and control, now found itself in a vulnerable situation, exposed to public scrutiny. Victoria, though devastated, maintained a facade of strength. She knew she had to protect her family's image, even in such a critical moment. However, inside, fear and guilt consumed her. Had her constant pressure driven her son to this state? Had she pushed Rick beyond his limits? Adela, for her part, began to emotionally distance herself from Rick. The possibility of losing the luxurious life she had imagined filled her with terror. Although she initially tried to show genuine concern, she soon began to avoid the hospital, finding excuses not to visit her fiancé. Her thoughts were centered on her future, and the idea of staying by the side of a man who might never wake up was unbearable to her. As Rick remained in a coma, the Smith family began to crumble under the pressure. The expectations, ambitions, and appearances that had held their world together for so long now wavered, threatening to destroy everything they had built. The hospital had become the silent guardian of Rick Smith's life. In the intensive care unit, his body lay still, surrounded by monitors and machines that watched over his every vital sign. Visits were rare and tense, allowed only for his closest family members and his fiancée, Adela. But beyond these scheduled visits, there was a constant presence in Rick's room, someone whose care extended beyond the professional, coming from a deeper place. Selena, a young immigrant nurse who worked at the hospital, had been assigned to Rick's care from the day he was admitted. For Selena, her work as a nurse was more than just a profession. It was a way to give meaning to her life after leaving behind her home, marked by war and loss. Seeing Rick in his vulnerable state stirred something deep within her. Though he was unconscious, Selena felt a connection with him, as if their pain was somehow intertwined. Selena took care of Rick's most delicate needs, monitoring his vital signs, adjusting medication levels, and watching for any changes in his condition. But beyond her duties, she spent time talking to him, believing that somehow her words could reach him. She shared stories about her life, her hopes and dreams, and sometimes she simply talked about the small everyday things happening in the hospital. The nurses who worked shifts with Selena began to notice her dedication. Though her relationship with Rick was purely professional, there was something in the way she cared for him that suggested a deeper commitment, a bond that went beyond what was expected in her job. Meanwhile, Adela grew increasingly distant. What had initially seemed like concern for Rick's health soon turned into a routine she followed without enthusiasm. Her visits became less frequent, and when she did show up, it was clear her mind was elsewhere. The shadow of Lucas, with his promises and manipulations, began to cloud her judgment, pulling her further away from her fiancé. Selena, unaware of the intrigues surrounding the Smith family, continued her work with dedication. Each day, she approached Rick's bedside, adjusted his sheets, and checked his vital signs with almost maternal care. Although she knew he was in a coma, she sometimes noticed small movements, slight contractions in his fingers, as if he were responding to her presence. The hospital was wrapped in a solemn silence, broken only by the soft beeping of the machines that monitored Rick Smith's fragile condition. While Selena continued her daily devotion, another kind of work was taking place outside the room. Thomas, Rick's best friend and lawyer, had begun investigating the circumstances that led to his collapse. Thomas, a man known for his sharp intuition and determination, couldn't accept that Rick's collapse was simply the result of stress. Something deeper troubled him, a sense that the events leading to his friend's fall had darker roots. Determined to uncover the truth, he began digging into Rick's business dealings, reviewing recent agreements, financial transactions, and the people who had been close to him in the past few months. The more he investigated, the more disturbing patterns he began to notice. There were transactions that didn't add up, high-risk investments that Rick normally wouldn't have approved, and unusual financial pressure that seemed to have been building in the months leading up to his collapse. Everything pointed to an external influence that had been manipulating the situation. Thomas's suspicions quickly focused on Lucas, the shrewd businessman who had started getting close to Adela shortly before Rick's collapse. Thomas had heard rumors about Lucas, about his questionable methods and his ability to influence those around him. The more Thomas dug, the clearer it became that Lucas had been pulling the strings from the shadows, using Adela as a key piece in his plans. As Thomas gathered evidence and connected the dots, his discoveries began to paint a disturbing picture. It seemed that Lucas had not only seen Rick as an opportunity to gain power and wealth, but he had also exploited Adela's fragile emotional state to further his own interests. Thomas knew he needed to act quickly. Every day that passed, Rick remained in a coma, defenseless against the machinations unfolding around him. The danger was not only physical, but also financial and emotional. Lucas' influence cast a shadow over the Smith fortune and future, and Thomas understood that stopping him would require more than just words. He needed solid evidence and a plan to expose the truth. Adela's time at the hospital decreased more and more. Her visits became a routine, a duty she fulfilled without conviction. Sitting by Rick's bed, her mind constantly wandered, seeking to escape the reality surrounding her. The image of Rick, once strong and dominant, now reduced to a state of extreme vulnerability, filled her with an unease she couldn't ignore. In her mind, the shadows of doubt began to grow, fed by Lucas's increasing presence in her life. Lucas was a cunning man, one who knew exactly what to say and when to say it. At first, his conversations with Adela had been superficial, small exchanges of courtesy during social events. But after Rick's collapse, Lucas found the perfect opportunity to get closer to her. He knew Adela was scared, that the future she had carefully planned was shaky, and he used that uncertainty to his advantage. One afternoon, as Adela left the hospital, Lucas was waiting outside, casually leaning against his luxury car. He invited her for coffee at a discreet place, away from prying eyes. Adela, needing a break from the oppressive hospital environment, accepted without much thought. Over coffee, Lucas displayed all his charm. He talked about his own projects, how he admired Adela's strength in such difficult times, and gradually introduced the idea that maybe she should think about her future in a more pragmatic way. He hinted that, although it was painful, she needed to prepare for any eventuality, even the possibility that Rick might not wake up. "Adela, you're an intelligent woman with a bright future," Lucas said, looking into her eyes. "You can't stay trapped in a situation with no way out. You need to protect yourself, to think about what's best for you." Adela listened in silence as the temptation of his words began to take root in her mind. Lucas offered her an alternative, an escape from the limbo she found herself in. With his promises of financial security and power, he started painting a future where she could maintain her status, no matter what happened to Rick. "I'm not telling you to abandon Rick, but you need to be realistic," Lucas continued, his tone soft and persuasive. "If you decide to take control of your life now, I'll be here to help you. Together, we could achieve incredible things." Adela felt a mixture of attraction and repulsion to what Lucas was suggesting. She knew that what he proposed wasn't morally right, but the desperation and fear of losing everything she had built began to cloud her judgment. Lucas's words echoed in her mind, tempting her to make decisions that, while selfish, would allow her to secure her future. At the hospital, as the hours turned into days and the days into weeks, Selena remained a constant presence in Rick's life. As his primary nurse, she took care of every aspect of his care. But there was something deeper in her attention, something that went beyond her professional duty. For Selena, taking care of Rick wasn't just a job, it was a personal mission. Each morning, as her shift began, Selena entered Rick's room with a serene calm. She adjusted the machines, monitoring his vital signs, checked his medications, and then sat beside him, holding his hand and speaking to him in a low voice. Although she knew Rick was in a coma and probably couldn't hear her, she continued talking to him, telling him about her day, about the small details of life in the hospital, and even about her own memories and hopes. Selena had learned to read the subtlest signs in Rick's body. She noticed when his muscles tensed slightly or when his breathing rhythm changed. And although the doctors insisted they were involuntary reflexes, she felt that in some way he was present, fighting to return. The other nurses watched her with respect. They knew Selena was doing more than her job required, and though they didn't fully understand her devotion, they recognized that there was something special in the connection she had formed with Rick. Meanwhile, the situation in the Smith family continued to deteriorate. Victoria maintained her facade of strength, but the reality was that each day without improvement in her son's condition wore her down more. Andres, for his part, felt increasingly lost, trapped in his brother's shadow even in his absence. Adela, though still his fiancée on paper, had almost completely distanced herself. Her attention was divided between Lucas's seductive promises and her own insecurities. However, every time she visited Rick, she couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt, a shadow of doubt about the path she was considering taking. Selena, unaware of the intrigues and tensions surrounding the family, focused on her work. She knew her job was to keep Rick stable, but in her heart, she also believed her presence could make a difference. Sometimes, while talking to him or reading aloud, she would see small signs like a slight movement in his hand or a blink of his eyelids that filled her with hope. The chapter closes with Selena preparing Rick's room for the night. The lights are dim and the atmosphere is calm. As she arranges the sheets and adjusts his pillow, she takes a moment to look at his face, still motionless but serene. She sits beside him, as she has done so many times before, and takes his hand. "I know you can hear me, Rick," she whispers, her voice full of conviction. "You're not alone, I'm here with you." In that moment, Rick, still in a coma, seems to respond with a slight squeeze of her hand. It's a tiny gesture, almost imperceptible, but for Selena, it's all she needs to keep believing that, deep down, Rick is fighting to return. The dawn brought with it an air of unease at the hospital, a feeling that something was about to change. Thomas, Rick's best friend, had spent the last few weeks immersed in his investigation, delving into the business and relationships surrounding his friend before his collapse. The deeper he dug, the clearer it became that the truth he was seeking was darker than he had imagined. Thomas had gathered enough evidence to seriously suspect Lucas. The suspicious transactions, the financial pressures, and Adela's strange behavior since Rick's collapse all pointed to a pattern of calculated manipulation. But what disturbed him most was the possibility that Lucas had been deliberately undermining Rick's health, using his position to push him to the brink. That morning, Thomas headed to the hospital with the determination to confront Adela. He knew that to protect Rick, he needed to break her free from Lucas's control, who was clearly manipulating her for his own purposes. When he arrived, he found her in the cafeteria, distracted, with a worried expression she couldn't hide. "Adela, we need to talk," Thomas said, his tone serious and urgent. Adela looked at him, surprised by the intensity in his voice, but nodded, knowing she couldn't avoid the confrontation. They moved to a private room in the hospital, away from prying eyes. Thomas didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I've been investigating what happened before Rick's collapse, and everything points to Lucas pulling the strings from the shadows. He's not only been manipulating the company's finances, but he's also been using your situation to consolidate his control. Adela, Lucas isn't on your side, he's using you." Adela felt her stomach drop. She had known on some level that Lucas wasn't entirely trustworthy, but hearing Thomas say it out loud made the reality hit hard. She tried to maintain her composure. "Do you have proof of what you're saying?" she asked, trying to sound defiant. Thomas nodded and handed her an envelope full of documents. "Here are the transactions, the contracts, everything I've been able to gather. Lucas has been diverting funds and taking advantage of the situation. If we don't stop him now, he could destroy everything Rick has built, and you could get caught in his web." Adela opened the envelope with trembling hands. As she read the documents, the reality settled into her mind. Lucas had deceived her, exploiting her fear and ambition to advance his own plans. "I don't know how I let this go so far," she whispered, more to herself than to Thomas. "There's still time to stop him, Adela," Thomas said firmly, "but we need your cooperation. You have to distance yourself from Lucas, and together we can expose him before he causes more harm." Adela looked up, her eyes filled with a mix of remorse and determination. She knew she had made a grave mistake, but she also knew she couldn't continue down this path. She had to choose between her loyalty to Rick and the temptation of the shortcuts Lucas offered. "You're right, Thomas. I can't let Lucas continue with this. I'll do whatever it takes to protect Rick and the family," Adela finally responded, making her decision. The hospital was wrapped in its usual morning calm when something unexpected happened in Rick Smith's room. After weeks in a coma, his body began showing signs of activity. His eyelids, which had remained closed for so long, started to twitch slightly. Selina, who was checking the monitors as she did every morning, was the first to notice the change. Her heart skipped a beat. "Rick," she whispered hopefully, moving closer to his side, her eyes fixed on his face, waiting for a clearer sign that he might be coming back. The monitors indicated a slight but clear improvement in his vital signs. His heart rate stabilized, and his breathing became deeper and more regular. Without taking her eyes off him, Selina pressed the emergency button to call the doctors. Within minutes, the medical team arrived and began examining him with quick, precise movements. As they ran tests, Rick slowly moved his hand as if trying to grasp something in the air. The lead doctor exchanged a significant look with Selina. "It looks like he's finally coming back," he said, with a mix of surprise and relief. Selina stayed by the bed, her hand resting on Rick's, her heart racing with anticipation. Slowly, Rick's eyes began to open, blinking under the bright light of the room. At first, everything was blurry for him, his mind struggling to orient itself after so much time in darkness. But then, his eyes met Selina's, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. "Where am I?" Rick murmured in a hoarse voice, his throat dry from lack of use. Selina smiled, a mix of relief and emotion flooding her face. "You're in the hospital, Rick. You've been in a coma, but now you're coming back. "Everything's going to be okay," she assured him, not letting go of his hand. Rick looked at her intently, his mind trying to piece together fragments of memories and sensations. He recognized her face, but couldn't understand why she was there, holding his hand with such care and devotion. "Who are you?" he asked, confused but also intrigued. "I'm Selina, your nurse. I've been taking care of you since you arrived here," she replied, with a softness in her voice that eased Rick's confusion. As Rick tried to process the situation, the doctors continued with their evaluations, confirming that, although weak, Rick was out of immediate danger. It was a moment of relief and hope for everyone in the room, especially for Selina, who had waited so long to see this sign of recovery. Meanwhile, the news of Rick's awakening spread quickly through the hospital. Victoria, his mother, and Adela were informed immediately. Adela felt a mix of relief and panic at the same time. She knew that her distance and the decisions she had made in the past weeks could complicate her relationship with Rick now that he was conscious. When Victoria arrived at the hospital, she found herself in a state of tension. She knew that the situation with Adela was complicated, but at that moment, the most important thing was that her son had returned. In the room, Selina remained by Rick's side, helping him take small sips of water and speaking to him in a low voice, answering his questions as best she could. Rick felt a sense of calm in her presence, something that comforted him amid his confusion. Rick Smith had awakened from his coma, but his mind was still trapped in the fog of confusion that enveloped him. Although his eyes were open and he recognized the people around him, there was a void in his memory, a lapse of time he couldn't recall. The hospital, with its white lights and the soft sounds of machines, felt strange, foreign. But what unsettled him the most was the expression on the faces of those around him. Tense faces, worried looks, and in some cases guilt. Selina had become his anchor, a figure of calm in the midst of chaos. She spent as much time as possible by his side, ensuring he was comfortable, patiently answering his questions, and helping him process his new reality. Although Rick still didn't fully understand who Selina was or why he felt so connected to her, he knew her presence was crucial to his recovery. The first days after his awakening were a whirlwind of medical tests and unanswered questions. The doctors were pleased with his progress, but knew the real battle was just beginning, the battle to reclaim his life. Meanwhile, news of his recovery spread quickly, drawing attention not only from his family, but also from the media, which speculated about the future of the powerful heir of the Smith family. Victoria Smith, always the strong matriarch, tried to maintain control amid the situation. Her visits to the hospital were constant, but there was a coldness in her interactions with Rick, a distance he sensed even though he couldn't fully explain it. Victoria was relieved that her son had awakened, but she also knew the decisions he would make in the coming weeks would define the family's future. There were secrets she had guarded closely for years, and now she feared everything would come to light. Adela, for her part, was caught in a consuming dilemma. She knew Rick's return meant facing the decisions she had made while he was unconscious. Lucas continued to pressure her, insinuating that Rick was no longer the same man, that he could no longer live the life they had planned together. Guilt and fear mixed within her, creating a knot in her stomach every time she thought about what she had done and what she might lose. Thomas, Rick's loyal friend, decided he could wait no longer. He knew Rick's recovery was fragile, but he also understood that the longer he waited, the more dangerous the situation would become. The documents he had gathered about Lucas's manipulations were ready, and it was time for Rick to know the truth. One afternoon, while Rick was resting in his room, Thomas entered with a serious expression. Selina, who was arranging Rick's sheets, looked at him with concern, sensing that something important was about to happen. Thomas approached Rick, and after a brief exchange of pleasantries, asked Selina to give them a moment alone. Selina nodded, giving Rick a supportive look before leaving the room. She knew Thomas was a close friend and trusted that what he had to say was important, but she couldn't help feeling a slight unease as she left them alone. Once they were alone, Thomas pulled up a chair and sat beside Rick's bed. his expression grave. "Rick, I know you've just woken up and are still processing a lot, but there's something you need to know as soon as possible," Thomas began, getting straight to the point. Rick looked at him, trying to focus on what his friend was about to say. Although his mind was still somewhat foggy, he could sense the urgency in Thomas's voice. "While you were in a coma, I've been investigating what happened before your collapse," Thomas continued. "What I've found is concerning, and I believe you need to know the truth to make the right decisions." Thomas handed Rick an envelope filled with documents. With trembling hands, Rick opened it and began to read. As his eyes scanned the lines of text, his expression grew more tense. The documents detailed the suspicious financial transactions, the high-risk investments he had never approved, and Lucas's maneuvers to take control of the company while he was incapacitated. "Lucas has been manipulating the situation from the shadows," Thomas said, filling in the gaps Rick was processing. "He's used his influence to destabilize the company, and worse, he's been taking advantage of your absence to get close to Adela, manipulating her into supporting his plans." Rick felt a knot in his stomach. Lucas's betrayal didn't surprise him, as much as the idea that Adela, the woman he had planned to spend his life with, could be involved in something like this. He leaned back against the pillow, closing his eyes as he tried to absorb the information. "I don't know exactly when Adela started giving in, but I believe she's been under Lucas's pressure for some time," Thomas added, his voice soft but firm. "I don't think all is lost with her, but you need to know the truth to decide how to proceed." Rick remained silent for a long moment. Thoughts raced through his mind, colliding with each other. The sense of betrayal, the confusion over how he had ended up in this situation, and the sadness over what he had lost while in a coma. Finally, he opened his eyes and looked at Thomas. "What do you suggest I do?" Rick asked, his voice low but determined. "First, you need to fully recover," Thomas replied. "You can't make any important decisions in this state, but when you're ready, we need to confront Lucas together. We have enough evidence to expose him and prevent him from causing more damage. As for Adela, that's up to you, Rick. She's made mistakes, but I believe she still has a chance to redeem herself if she's willing to distance herself from Lucas and work with you." Rick nodded slowly. He knew Thomas was right. He couldn't act rashly, but he also couldn't ignore what he had discovered. He needed time to think, to evaluate his options, and to decide how he wanted to proceed. "Thank you, Thomas," he finally said, looking at his friend with gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done without you." "I'll always be here for you, Rick," Thomas replied, his smile serious. "But for now, you need to rest. We'll handle this when you're stronger." Thomas left the room, leaving Rick alone with his thoughts. Shortly after, Selina returned, her comforting presence filling the room. She didn't ask what had happened during the conversation with Thomas, but she noticed the tension on Rick's face. "Are you okay?" she asked, moving closer to him. Rick looked at her and nodded, though he knew okay wasn't the right word. But at that moment, he didn't want to talk about what he had just learned. Instead, he took Selina's hand and held it tightly, as if seeking support in their silent connection. "Thank you for being here," he murmured, his eyes reflecting the mix of emotions overwhelming him. Selina smiled, gently squeezing his hand in response. "You don't need to thank me, Rick. I'll be here for as long as you need." The days following the conversation with Thomas were a mix of introspection and preparation for Rick. While his body continued to recover, his mind was constantly processing the betrayal, lies, and half-truths that had surrounded his life in recent months. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Adela's face, but he could no longer see in her the woman he once loved and trusted. Instead, he saw someone who had lost her way, trapped between her insecurities and Lucas's manipulation. Selina remained his refuge during those difficult days. Although Rick hadn't shared everything he had discovered, her presence helped him stay calm. There was something in the way she cared for him, in the sincerity of her gestures and the peace she radiated, that gave him the strength to face what he knew he had to do. Finally, the day arrived. Thomas and Rick had agreed it was time to confront Adela and Lucas. They knew it wouldn't be easy. That much was at stake, and that the confrontation could have unpredictable consequences, but they also knew it was necessary. The company, the family, and Rick's future depended on what happened in that meeting. The confrontation was arranged at the Smith Mansion, a place where Rick would feel more in control and where he could ensure that any conversation that occurred would be safe from prying ears. Thomas had made all the preparations, including the presence of a notary and a security team, in case things got out of hand. Rick, though still physically weak, insisted on being present and leading the confrontation. He felt it was his responsibility to take charge of his life again. When Adela and Lucas arrived, the tension was palpable. Adela was visibly nervous. She knew something important was about to happen, but she didn't understand the magnitude of what was at stake. Lucas, on the other hand, maintained his usual facade of confidence, certain that he could manipulate the situation to his advantage, as he had done so many times before. Rick, seated at the head of the table in the grand meeting room, greeted them with a calm that hid the internal storm consuming him. Thomas was by his side, his documents organized and ready to be presented. "Thank you for coming," Rick began, his voice firm but calm. "There are things we need to discuss, and I think it's best to do it all at once." Adela exchanged a glance with Lucas, who nodded slightly, indicating that she should remain calm. They both took seats across from Rick and Thomas, prepared for what was to come, though they had no idea the extent of what Rick knew. Adela," Rick continued, directing his gaze to her, "I've been thinking a lot since I woke up. About us, about what we've been through, and about the decisions we've made." Adela swallowed hard, trying to maintain her composure. "Rick, she began, but he interrupted her with a gentle gesture of his hand. "Please let me finish," Rick said, keeping his composure. "During my recovery, Thomas has been investigating what happened before I fell into a coma. What we discovered was shocking, to say the least." Adela's face paled, while Lucas's expression remained inscrutable. He knew this was a critical moment, but he still didn't grasp the full extent of what Rick had uncovered. "Lucas, during my absence, you've been manipulating my company's finances, diverting funds, making decisions without my consent, and worse, taking advantage of Adela's vulnerability for your own ends," Rick said, his words cutting through the air like knives. Lucas frowned, his confident facade beginning to crumble. "Rick, I don't know what you're talking about. Everything I've done has been to protect your interests and ensure your company remained successful in your absence," Lucas replied, his voice sharper than usual. Thomas, his expression firm, pulled a set of documents from his briefcase and slid them across the table to Adela and Lucas. "These documents prove otherwise, Lucas," Thomas said. "Here are the records of the transfers you made, the contracts you signed without Rick's authorization, and the records of the secret meetings you held with certain investors to destabilize the company and position yourself as the new leader." Adela took the documents with trembling hands and began to read them. As her eyes scanned the pages, her face grew even paler. Lucas, realizing that the evidence was overwhelming, attempted one last move. "Rick, you may be angry, but we need to be rational. Everything I did was in the best interest of the company. You were incapacitated, and someone had to make decisions. Adela can confirm that I was only trying to keep everything afloat," Lucas said, trying to get Adela to back him up. Adela looked up from the documents, her eyes filled with tears. She knew the moment had come to decide whose side she was really on. "Lucas, I can't keep doing this," Adela said, her voice breaking. "I can't keep lying. Rick, I made a mistake. I should have distanced myself from Lucas when he started suggesting all those things. But I was afraid of losing everything. I thought if I helped him, I could keep our life intact. But now I realize I only made things worse." Adela's words fell like a painful confession. Rick watched her, his expression difficult to read. He had expected some kind of betrayal, but hearing her admit her mistake still hurt more than he had anticipated. "Adela, I understand that the situation was complicated," Rick said, his voice softer now. "But that doesn't justify what you did. However, what concerns me now is how we're going to get out of this. Lucas, seeing that Adela had betrayed him, finally revealed his true colors. He stood up from his chair, his expression no longer that of a charming, confident man, but of someone cornered. "Rick, if you try to stop me, I assure you, you won't come out unscathed. I have contacts, influences you can't imagine. This is your last chance to step aside and let me handle things. If you don't, I'll destroy not only you but everyone you love," he said, with a threatening tone that made the air in the room feel heavy. Rick stood up as well, though more slowly due to his recovering state. He looked directly into Lucas's eyes, unwavering. "That's what separates people like you from people like me, Lucas," Rick responded, his voice filled with a determination he hadn't shown in weeks. "I'm not afraid to face the consequences of my decisions. You, on the other hand, have lived your entire life hiding behind threats and manipulations. But today, that ends." Thomas signaled, and immediately the security team waiting in the hallway entered the room. Lucas, caught off guard, had no time to react, before being surrounded and escorted out of the mansion. As they took him away, he cast one last hateful glance at Rick and Adela. When Lucas disappeared from view, the room was enveloped in a heavy silence. Adela sat back down, unable to stop the tears streaming down her face. "Rick, I'm so sorry. I don't know how I can make up for what I did," she said, her voice trembling. Rick watched her for a long moment before responding. He knew he couldn't simply forgive what had happened, but he also understood that moving forward meant finding a way to heal, both for himself and for her. "Adela, what's done can't be undone," he finally said. "We both need time to understand what we want and whether there's a future for us. But for now, the most important thing is to focus on repairing the damage that's been done, both to the company and in our lives." Adela nodded, knowing she couldn't expect more from him at that moment. But the promise of a second chance, though uncertain, gave her a small glimmer of hope that maybe not everything was lost. Rick knew this was only the beginning of a long road to recovery, not just for his health, but for everything that had been put at risk. But for the first time since waking up, he felt in control of his life again, and with Selena and Thomas by his side, he was ready to face whatever came next. The day after the confrontation with Lucas left a heavy air in the Smith mansion. Although the immediate threat had been neutralized, the emotional and psychological aftermath weighed heavily on everyone involved. Rick, still recovering physically, felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. He had won a battle, but the war to restore his life and his family's was far from over. That morning, after a restless night's sleep, Rick decided it was time to confront another figure who had been on his mind since his awakening. His mother, Victoria Smith. Rick had always admired Victoria's strength, but he was also aware of how she had controlled every aspect of his life since he could remember. He knew their relationship had been complex and filled with expectations he had tried to meet, but he also knew it was time to speak with her honestly and directly. Victoria was in her study, a place that had always been her personal sanctuary, surrounded by family memories and symbols of the power she had held for so many years. When Rick entered, she greeted him with a reserved smile, though her eyes showed a mix of pride and concern. "Mother, we need to talk," Rick said, closing the door behind him. Victoria nodded and stood up from her chair, walking over to the window where she could see the vast gardens of the mansion. "I've always known this day would come, Rick," she replied without turning around. "The day we would have to face the decisions I've made for this family." Rick slowly approached, taking a seat next to his mother. The emotional distance between them had been palpable all his life, but now, after everything that had happened, Rick felt it was necessary to break down that wall, not just for his own well-being, but for the future of the family. "Mother, for years I've tried to live up to the expectations you placed on me. I've worked to maintain the Smith reputation, to grow the company. But in the process, I think I've lost part of myself," Rick began, his voice filled with a mix of sadness and determination. Victoria finally turned to look at him, her expression firm, but there was a shadow of vulnerability in her eyes that Rick had rarely seen. "I know, son, and I'm very sorry that you had to bear that weight, but I always thought it was necessary, that to preserve what your father and I built, You had to be strong, even at the cost of your own happiness, Victoria responded with a sincerity that surprised Rick. Rick took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts before continuing. I understand, Mother, but I can't keep living in that shadow. I've been in a coma on the brink of death, and it's made me see things differently. I want our family to move forward, but not at the cost of losing who I am. I need to do things my way, and for that, I need your support, not as the matriarch who controls every aspect of our lives, but as my mother. Victoria observed him in silence for a long moment, evaluating his words. She knew Rick was right. She had controlled every aspect of his life, fearing that if she didn't, everything they had built would crumble. But seeing him now, after everything he had been through, she understood that her son had changed, and that her role in his life needed to change as well. Rick, I've always wanted what's best for you, even if it meant making difficult decisions. But you're right, I can't keep making those decisions for you. If you're ready to take the reins of your life and this family, I will support you. I just hope that in the process, we don't lose what makes us strong, Victoria said, finally showing a bit of the vulnerability she had kept hidden for so long. Rick felt a relief he hadn't expected. He knew not everything was resolved, but his mother's words were a first step toward a new dynamic between them. Thank you, Mother. I don't know what the future holds, but I know that together we can face it, Rick said, standing up to hug her. Victoria returned the hug, and for the first time in a long while, Rick felt truly connected with her, not just as mother and son, but as two people who understood the weight of the decisions they had to make. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the mansion, Adela was facing her own demons. After the confrontation with Lucas, she had spent the night wide awake, reflecting on what she had done and the future that awaited her. She knew her relationship with Rick had changed irreparably, and though he had shown an understanding she didn't feel she deserved, she also knew she couldn't just wait for everything to go back to the way it was. Adela decided she needed to speak with Selena. She had heard of the nurse who had cared for Rick during his coma, and though she didn't know her personally, she knew Selena had played a crucial role in Rick's recovery. What Adela didn't expect was the mix of emotions she would feel when coming face to face with the woman who, in many ways, had filled the void she herself had left. Selena was in Rick's room, preparing some medications and adjusting the machines monitoring his vital signs, when Adela entered. Seeing her, Selena looked up, surprised by the unexpected visit, but she maintained her composure. "Hello, Adela. Is there something I can help you with?" Selena asked with professional courtesy. Adela, feeling slightly out of place, nodded slowly. "I wanted to talk to you, Selena. I know you've been taking care of Rick all this time, and I wanted to thank you for what you've done. I know he wouldn't be here without you," Adela said, her voice betraying her nervousness. Selena smiled slightly, though there was no joy in her eyes. "I've just been doing my job, Adela. But Rick is a strong man. He's fought hard to come back." Adela felt even more uncomfortable, but she knew she had to go through with what she wanted to say. "I know, and I don't know how to say this without sounding insensitive, but do you have feelings for Rick?" she finally asked, confronting the question she had been avoiding. Selena was surprised by Adela's frankness, but she remained calm. "Adela, my relationship with Rick is professional. My job is to care for him, to ensure his recovery, nothing more. But I'm also human, and I've come to care about his well-being. If there's something more, that's something only he can decide," Selena responded, her tone firm but kind. Adela nodded, realizing the situation was more complicated than she had wanted to admit. "I just want you to know that even though I made mistakes, I really care about Rick. And if there's any chance to fix things between us, I want to try. But I also know I can't force it," Adela said, feeling the weight of her own words. Selena observed her for a moment before responding. "Adela, what matters most is what Rick wants. I'll be here to help him with whatever he needs, but the rest is up to you two. Just make sure you're honest with him, and with yourself," Selena said, her words full of wisdom. Adela nodded again, understanding that she had a lot to reflect on. She said goodbye to Selena and left the room, leaving the nurse alone with her thoughts. The morning sun gently illuminated the Smith mansion, but inside, the shadows of the past were still slowly fading away. The recent days had been crucial for everyone involved in the events, but now, a new day brought with it the promise of a different future, perhaps brighter, but undoubtedly more complex. Rick, still in the process of recovery, sat in the main hall, surrounded by documents and business plans he had begun to review. Although he physically felt stronger, he knew that emotionally there was still a long way to go. However, there was one decision he had made, one he knew he had to communicate to those who mattered most to him. Victoria entered the hall, her imposing presence filling the space. She had seen her son change in recent days, and although she was still worried about his health, she knew Rick was determined to take control of his life once more. "Mother, thank you for coming," Rick said, carefully standing up to greet her. "I'll always be here for you, Rick," Victoria responded, with a warmth that had previously been hidden under layers of formality. Rick gestured for her to sit beside him, and after a brief silence, he began to speak. "I've been thinking a lot about everything that's happened, about the company, our family, and my own future, and I believe it's time to make some changes," Rick said, with a firmness he hadn't shown in a long time. Victoria looked at him with curiosity and a hint of concern. "What kind of changes, son?" Rick took a breath before continuing. "I want to focus the company on more than just generating profits. I want it to have a positive impact on the community, to support causes that truly matter. Also, I need to delegate some of my responsibilities so I can concentrate on my recovery and other areas of my life that I've neglected," Rick explained, making it clear that he was determined not to return to the same routine that had led him to the brink of collapse. Victoria nodded slowly, understanding that her son was seeking a balance she herself had never considered. She had raised Rick to be strong, to be the leader of the family, but now she saw that true strength lay in knowing when to make changes and adapt. "I'm proud of you, Rick. These changes will be good for all of us, but you must ensure that the transition is done carefully. The company is part of our legacy, and we must protect it," Victoria responded, showing her support. "I know, Mother. That's why I want Andres to take a more active role in management. It's time for him to find his own path within the company, and for all of us to work together to create something bigger than ourselves," Rick said, determined to strengthen family and business ties. While mother and son discussed the details, Adela was at her own crossroads. After her conversation with Selena, she had spent days reflecting on her relationship with Rick and the decisions she had made. She knew she needed to face Rick again, this time with the truth and vulnerability she had been avoiding for so long. Finally, she gathered the courage to seek out Rick. She found him in the living room, still discussing things with Victoria. She waited until the conversation ended, and Victoria left before approaching him. Rick saw her coming, and though he knew this conversation was inevitable, he couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions. "Rick, can we talk?" Adela asked, her voice soft but firm. Rick nodded, motioning for her to take a seat across from him. "Adela, I know you've been dealing with a lot. I have too, and I think it's time we talked honestly about us," Rick said, determined to face whatever Adela had to say. Adela took a deep breath, preparing for what she knew would be a difficult conversation. "Rick, I know I've failed you. During your coma, I made serious mistakes. I let fear and insecurity take over, and I allowed Lucas to manipulate me. I have no excuses for what I did, but I want you to know that despite everything, I never stopped caring about you. I never stopped loving you," Adela confessed, her eyes filled with tears she couldn't hold back. Rick looked at her in silence, processing her words. He knew Adela was being sincere, but he also knew the trust they had shared had been deeply damaged. "Adela, I appreciate your honesty, and I think we both know our relationship has changed irreversibly. I still care about you, but I don't know if we can go back to what we had before." Rick responded, with a sadness that reflected the loss of what had once been a promising relationship. Adela nodded, knowing this was the truth she had feared facing. "I understand, Rick, and if that means we need to go our separate ways, I'll accept it. I just want you to be happy, and if that means we need to distance ourselves, I'll do it," Adela said, accepting the consequences of her actions. Rick stood up and approached her, taking her hands in his. I want us both to have the chance to find what we really want in life, Adela. I don't know what the future holds, but I believe we both deserve a fresh start, whether together or apart, Rick said, his voice full of sincerity. Adela nodded, though tears filled her eyes, understanding that this might be the end of their relationship as they knew it, but also the beginning of something new, something they both needed. After that conversation, Rick felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He knew he had made the right decision, even if it wasn't easy. But he also knew there was still another important conversation to have, one that could change his life in a way he hadn't anticipated. That night, after everyone had retired, Rick sought out Selena. He found her on the terrace, gazing at the stars, enjoying a moment of tranquility after a hectic day. When she saw him approach, she smiled but noticed the seriousness in his expression. "Selena, can I talk to you?" Rick asked, his voice soft, almost shy. "Of course, Rick, you can always talk to me," Selena responded, giving him space to express what was on his mind. Rick joined her on the terrace, leaning on the railing beside her as they looked up at the starry sky. "Since I woke up, you've been by my side, caring for me and supporting me in a way I can never thank you enough for," Rick began, searching for the right words. "But during this time, I've felt something more, something that makes me want to know you beyond your role as my nurse. I feel there's a connection between us, something that goes beyond anything I've experienced before." Selena looked at him, surprised by his openness, but also feeling a warmth in her chest that she hadn't expected. "Rick, I don't know what to say. I care about you a lot, and of course I've felt a special connection with you, but—" Selena began to say, but Rick gently interrupted her. "I'm not asking for an immediate answer, Selena. I just want you to know how I feel. I want us both to have the chance to explore what this could be, without pressure, without expectations, just two people who found each other at a complicated time in their lives and who might, just might, find something beautiful together," Rick said, with a sincerity that made Selena's heart race. Selena looked into his eyes, seeing the vulnerability and hope in his expression. She knew her feelings for Rick had also grown during the time she had spent caring for him, but she also knew they both needed time to understand what they truly wanted. "Rick, I feel something for you too, something I can't deny, but as you said, we need time. Time to heal, to discover who we are outside of everything that's happened. If you're willing to explore this with me, with patience and honesty, then I think we could find something beautiful, as you say," Selena responded, taking his hand in a gesture of promise. Rick smiled, feeling a renewed hope for the first time in a long while. "Then let's take that time, Selena. There's no rush, I just want to be with you, to get to know you and see where this new path takes us," Rick said, gently squeezing her hand. Rick and Selena on the terrace, gazing at the starry sky, shared a moment of deep connection. Though the future is uncertain, both are willing to face it together. With the promise of something new and true, they left behind the shadows of the past and prepared to build a future full of possibilities. Rick had immersed himself in the reorganization of the company, implementing the changes he had discussed with his mother. Andres, now more involved than ever, had proven to be capable and dedicated, finding his own place in the company and earning the respect of the employees and the family. The Smith Company not only began to thrive again, but also found a new purpose, focusing on projects that not only generated profits, but also had a positive impact on the community. Victoria, though still an imposing figure in the family, had learned to relinquish control, trusting more in the decisions of her sons. She had taken on more of a mentor role than that of a leader, advising Rick and Andres but allowing them to make their own decisions. This change had been difficult for her, but seeing her sons grow and thrive, she knew it was the right thing to do. Adela, for her part, had decided she needed time away from the Smith family to rediscover herself. She applied for a scholarship to study abroad in a personal development program that would help her explore new perspectives and heal the wounds she had caused and received. Rick supported her in this decision, knowing it was best for both of them. Before she left, they shared a final goodbye, a moment of peace and mutual acceptance. Although they didn't know if their paths would cross again, both were at peace with the idea that they each needed to follow their own path. Selena continued working at the hospital, but her relationship with Rick had slowly evolved. They had kept their promise to take the time to get to know each other outside the context of the hospital and the crisis that had initially brought them together. They shared dinners, walks, and deep conversations, learning more about each other and finding a genuine connection that went beyond the circumstances that had united them. One afternoon, while walking through the gardens of the mansion, Rick decided it was time to talk about the future. "Selena, these past few months have been a roller coaster, but they've also been some of the most meaningful moments of my life," Rick began, stopping under the shade of a large oak tree. Selena looked at him with a gentle but expectant smile. "I agree, Rick. They've been difficult times, but we've also found something very special between us," she replied, taking his hand. Rick took a deep breath, preparing to say what he wanted. "Selena, I've come to know you in a way I never thought possible. What I feel for you is real, and I want to build something solid, something lasting. I know we didn't want to rush things, but I think we're ready to take the next step if you feel the same," he said, his voice full of sincerity. Selena looked into his eyes, feeling a mix of emotions that filled her with joy and anticipation. "Rick, I feel the same way. I want to be with you, to build a future together. But I also want us both to keep growing, to not lose who we are individually," she responded, her eyes shining with the same sincerity. Rick smiled, relieved and excited at the same time. "That's all I want, Selena, to grow together but also to support each other on our individual paths. I don't have all the answers, but I'm willing to find them with you," he said, gently squeezing her hand. Selena nodded, feeling that they were finally ready to begin this new chapter. "Then let's move forward together," she said, sealing her promise with a gentle kiss, full of love and hope. As the sun began to set, bathing the gardens in a golden light, Rick and Selena walked back to the mansion, ready to face whatever the future held, knowing that with each other's support, they could overcome anything. Rick and Selena entering the mansion hand in hand symbolized the beginning of a new life. The mansion, once a symbol of pressure and expectations, now felt like a home where the family could thrive in peace and purpose. Under the renewed leadership of Rick and Andres, the Smith Company began to forge a legacy, not just based on financial success, but on positive impact in the community. Victoria, watching from her office window, smiled with pride and satisfaction. She knew she had done the right thing by relinquishing control, allowing her sons to create a new path for the family. Adela, from her new home abroad, looked toward the future with optimism, ready to rediscover herself and build a more authentic life. And so, with each character on their way to a brighter future, the story of Rick, Selena, and the Smith family came to an end, not with a final closure, but with the promise of new beginnings, growth, and the possibility of a love that, though unexpected, had found its place in the midst of the most difficult trials. And so our story ends today, full of unexpected twists, intense emotions, and characters who have taken us to explore the deepest corners of love, betrayal, and redemption. If you enjoyed this journey with Rick, Selena, Adela, and everyone else, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next stories full of drama and emotion. Let us know in the comments what you thought of this ending and what lessons you're taking from this story. What would you have done in Rick's place? We'd love to read your opinion. Remember that every story is a reflection of our own experiences and decisions, and there's always something to learn from them. So keep dreaming, keep exploring, and above all, keep loving. See you in the next video. Goodbye for now.